So what I wanted to do is just begin with some sort of higher level stuff, just to put the NDIS and individualized funding in a broader context. Look at some of the elements beyond just the funding side of what needs to be in place to actually make a difference with individualized funding. Then I thought I'd just go through some of the challenges and issues that have arisen in other jurisdictions in using individualized funding. I was quite involved in setting up our structure in British Columbia, and we kicked that off in 2005. And as these things go, it hasn't all been smooth sailing, so I thought I would share the learnings from our mistakes so you can hopefully avoid them. Then I'm going to talk a bit about, because I know most of you folks are all from service provision organizations, is that right? So I thought I'd talk a bit about what we call unbundling and how do you move from a more block system to a more individualized system. And then I will talk a bit about individualized funding in rural and remote communities, and then kind of a quick run through things that we've seen in other jurisdictions that seem to make this work well. You're all aware sorry, I know why I'm struggling. That's not going to reach up here, is it? I can't actually see my slides, so forgive me if I'm careening, but individualized funding is very much part of a broader movement towards a rights-based system from a more charity kind of approach that historically has been the nature of our system. So the UN Convention really solidifies the broad international goals of where we want to get to. And IF and some of the other bits are really just tools to help us move towards this broader goal. So I just highlighted some, I think, the key principles of the convention that make sense to think about when we're talking about individualized funding. So obviously respect for the inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices and independence of persons, and full and effective participation and inclusion in society is really what this is all about. I haven't got up here Article 12, which is the article around supported decision making. So it basically affirms that people with disabilities are persons before the law. It sounds a bit axiomatic and obvious, but in fact, in most jurisdictions and historically, people have not been legal persons if you have a significant cognitive disability. So that's a fairly significant change that's going to impact a lot of what we do, because in the past, most jurisdictions, it was quite legal to decide for people with intellectual disabilities, to make decisions on their behalf, to decide what was in their best interest. Under the new convention, and it's quite explicit, it doesn't use the language of presumption of capacity, it states an assumption of capacity. So in other words, they'd want to take away this ability for us to remove that presumption. So it really does have impact on how we do our work and how we have to approach the changes we want to make. So in simple terms, that it really changes the nature of the relationship between the person with a disability and the state and the providers as kind of agents of the state, if you like. So we're trying to move from a charity system to a rights-based system. We want the users of our system to no longer be a passive recipient of service, but to be in active control of our services. And that's quite a radical change. And it's change that I think most of us, and I'm sure most of you, have been working towards for a number of years without the NDIS. The hope is that we can use things like the NDIS to accelerate that process and put in some of the structural elements that may have been missing to actually allow that to happen. So if you look across different jurisdictions in terms of how do we actually actualize people's rights in a very challenging context where people can't necessarily just simply stand up and say, I want to do this. As I'm sure all you know, as well or better than I do, sometimes it's not that easy to understand what a person actually wants if they can't communicate formally stuff. So there's three elements that I think are key to any system, regardless of your jurisdiction or how you particularly operationalize it. When I go into somewhere to consult or talk to government or stuff, first thing I'll do is I'll look whether these three elements are in place somewhere in the system. So the first is around the decision-making part, because if we want to move to a system that's based on people making their own decisions, making their own choices, and being in control of those choices, the first thing we have to do is to give them voice, to find a way to allow them to express their preferences or their will or what they want. And that's not easy with folks with complex disabilities. So that's why we need to also think about things like supported decision-making, which has both a legal aspect and a practical aspect. How do we empower families and advisors to interpret, not speak for people, but to interpret what they would like based on the fact that they know them best? In Canada, we have something, in BC, we have a Representation Agreement Act, which allows a family or another person with a close personal relationship to actually have the legal authority to represent that person with services, with banks, with healthcare practitioners, without stripping them of their rights, which a guardianship system does. Essentially, guardianship transfers rights to another person. What a representation system does is empower someone to interpret the will of the individual to the system and to have that legally recognized. So under a rep agreement, a healthcare provider can't ignore a representative's decisions on behalf of a person. A service provider can't ignore that. So there's a legal structure, and then there's a whole complex bit of how do we actually do that. And we had a great day in Melbourne the other day just focusing on the complexities of this. So that brings in the advocacy and all those kind of systems. So a system like the NDIS is going to fail completely in most cases if we don't have the mechanism to do this. The independent planning and facilitation is more the technical aspect. So once people express their will and say what they want, you need the means to actually help them put that in place. So you need the person who can help that individual and their representatives understand the implications of different choices and then put those choices into action. So someone might say, well, you know, I'd really like to live in this condo downtown. So the facilitator's role might be to say, well, you realize that costs $3,000 a month. We don't have $3,000 a month, so let's look at what we can do that gets us closest to that, or how we can work towards that. So that facilitator, I guess in Australia probably the best equivalent is that would be the local area coordinator's role, to help people make the decisions and then put them into place. In BC, we use the term facilitation. So we have facilitators whose role is to help with the planning systems, to put the plan in place, and to monitor the plan over time to make sure it's still meeting their needs. And lastly is obviously the actual individualized funding. But I think our experience across the world, and certainly in BC with some of our attempts around this, is if you have individualized funding without these other elements, outcomes won't necessarily improve and actually have a significant possibility of being worse for the person in terms of their isolation within the system. A few sort of key elements. I tend to like to think of the structure as a rights structure. So the same way we think of our democratic structures, the US is probably the simplest to understand. One of the key principles of a political structure is division and separation of powers. So the Supreme Court is separate from the political branch, the executive branch is separate from the Congress, and they have very strict powers in order to achieve a balance of power which avoids any one element being able to dominate a system. and provides a system of checks and balances. And that's essentially what we want to try to set up for our social services. So one of the key areas, and to be honest, one of the areas I'm most worried about with the NDIS is if you put the planner in the same place as the funder and or the provider, then you have an inherent conflict of interest, particularly if the planner and the funder are the same person. Because regardless of their stated motivations or their personal values, there is no structural protection against the planner under planning because they're also the one who has to pay for it. So if they work for the government who's funding this, they know who's paying their salary. If their manager's saying, we've got to cut back on our budget, there's a real pressure on them to not take planning from a pure perspective of what does this person want, who are they, and where do they want to go, and to think, all right, well, how can we do this as cheaply as possible? So you want to try to pull apart those elements so that you have this balance of power and you avoid that conflict of interest. Again, the planning and facilitation needs to be, in my view, outside of the service system, again, to avoid that. The UK had a great term they used of service-led assessment, they used to call it. And basically what that meant in the old system in the UK, you went in and people didn't say, what do you want to do with your life? Who do you want to be? Where do you want to get to? They said, right, you need residential services. Here's the list of what we have. Let's match you with this service and we'll put you in here. So it's the service that's leading the planning, not the desires and goals and wishes of the individual. So you want to try to separate those two out. And lastly, the decision-making side needs to be left as tightly as possible with the individual and with their representatives. Again, that's why the whole supported decision-making piece is critical to making this system work in terms of actually achieving these goals set out by the convention. So I like to talk about when you go for funding, if you have that decision-making authority, you're really going from a position of strength and power, and you're negotiating your supports rather than being allocated your supports, which in a traditional system, we tend to have an allocation system, that you have very little power to actually negotiate that. With an NDIS type system or an individualized funding system, you are in a lot stronger position to negotiate rather than simply be allocated services. So that's just some broad issues around where I think we need to be getting to in terms of the overall structure for something like the NDIS. So what are the issues that always comes up in every jurisdiction? Well, how do we move from a block-funded system to this individualized system? You can't just wave a magic wand in, when is it, 2019, and the system's going to magically transfer over. As we had, British Columbia, for instance, we had quite a number of group homes. We've been sort of moving away from that, and most people using individualized funding, well, virtually all of them aren't using group homes. But one of the problems that providers talked to us about was that, well, you can't just remove one person, two person from that group home, because the funding and the whole financial stability of that was designed to have 4 people, 5 people. So it's and similar to day supports or any kind of collective supports, when you start to break them apart, there's a transition problem that seems to occur in a lot of people. Oh, sorry, I think I skipped ahead of myself. Yes, I did. So this is a very simple map of what our traditional structures of social services have been. Right? So you have the funding agency, usually the government, funds the provider, they provide the service to the individual. And that's pretty typical the world over. If you look at that little diagram and you think about it from a position of power, who is the least powerful actor in that diagram? Right? It's that one up there, right? So the power is flowing from here through there and eventually dribbles down to the person. So in an IF system, we want to try to turn that on its head and make the most powerful person in that system the individual. So here we have the funder. The plan determines how much funding they get. That goes to the person. And then they make choices about whether they use provider agencies, whether they directly hire folks, or whether they just go out into the general community. So whether they just go to their local leisure center and say, you know, I'd like to do my swimming here. I need a little help, but I've got some funding to pay for a swim coach or whatever. So it gives them a lot more choice. And again, in terms of the power structure of this system, the power is shifted to the person. Not totally, but it changes that equation. It actually gives them some control and some choice, as we like to say these days. There's a whole lot of variety of approaches across the world on how this has been done. In BC, we use a mix of multiple approaches. So you have the simple direct funding model, which is you get your plan, you negotiate your funding comes to you, you hire the people you want to support you. And that can work very well for folks with physical disabilities who don't need a whole lot of gobbledygook. They know what they need. They just want to get their funds, get on with hiring their support. It doesn't work particularly well for people with intellectual disabilities unless there's a strong network around them. So a lot of countries have gone to systems, we use the term host agency, where rather than having to manage and do all the hiring, firing, employment work, they will use an agency, usually a community social service agency, that the money, they take their plan, they say what they want, but the agency does all the administrative side. They still choose who they want to hire, stuff, but all of that management burden is now handled by the host agency side. Similarly, in the States, that's really an unpleasant kind of term I always found for some reason, but the fiscal intermediary is big in the States, and they tend to be a private, usually accountant type firm that just does the bookkeeping. So a little less robust than a host agency, where you have an agency that knows the sector, understands how it works and stuff. But for a lot of people, that can work as well. In Illinois, they have a system which I wouldn't call a pure IF system, but it's a system where families can choose to take a monthly amount, and it's a fixed amount. It's about, last time I checked, it was about $1,300 a month, and support their son or daughter however they choose. So if they want to simply use the money to allow one of the family members to not work and stay home, they can do that. If they want to hire people to come in, they can do that. They can use it for respite. So it's a very open program, but the quid pro quo there, it's all or nothing. So if you take this funding, you have no access to any other state services or community services. So it's not a great model, but it has been effective. In the States, they still have a lot of institutions, and so they found that folks who use this model are far less likely to end up using an institutional facility than not. So it's had some benefits. The early local authority, local area coordinators were really what I'd call a catalyst model. In Western Australia, they didn't get large amounts of money. They didn't get enough money to fund all the services, but they got money that the local area coordinator could help them use to stimulate community natural supports and those things. I think there was a lot of merit in it. I think the problem with that was that for folks who weren't going to be able to stimulate enough natural community supports, really weren't going to benefit from that from the long run. And I think the new approach with the the NDIS, sorry, I get my acronyms messed up here, I don't think I think it's intended to have a full funding package rather than just small catalyst and things. In BC, we have a couple of interesting sort of models. We have something called microboards. And microboards are a registered agency whose sole job it is to support one person. So they have names like Lucy's Dream Society. They do, actually. That's what they're often called. They're kind of cool names. And that's usually set up by families and close friends. And one of the things I like about that model is it builds all the elements together. So you have a personal network. They will often have a representation agreement attached to one of the people on it. They will take the individualized funding and they will actually do the management, helping to hire, fire, find an apartment, do the day supports, all through this group of volunteer friends and family that circle around them. Similar are what we call family governance models. And I don't know about down this part of the world, but I know Queensland has some really good small family governance models where you put together maybe 2, 3, 4, 10 families get together and collectively support their 10 kids and share the management responsibilities. In terms of residential, it's usually financially not very feasible for everybody to live in their own apartment with full-time support. So they will maybe get an apartment where 2, 3 people will share it and the families will collectively manage, hire the staff, do all that sort of bit. So I think there's a lot of promise in those kind of models, and I think, again, that's a role for community agencies and for these sort of brokerage type agencies to help bring families together. So if you have a person who wants to live in their own, you can't afford the support they require for one person, but another family over here who needs the same thing, bringing them together and helping them set up that kind of collective arrangement is a really useful facilitative role. User-led support models are kind of a slightly different thing. I think the best examples were the early UK, what they call disabled persons organizations. In the early direct payments in the UK, a lot of the local authorities funded disabled persons organizations to be kind of a combination of the management, information, training, facilitation, and they would do everything. If you're a user and you want help with contracts, they would provide you with sample contracts. They might provide you help with the advertising, how do you find staff. They might provide a location for interviewing staff, which was really critical in the UK for people with physical disabilities, because what a lot of them said, well, I don't want to put an ad in the paper that says, vulnerable person lives here, come to my house to be interviewed. So providing a venue that allowed that to happen and they could get help with that. They often provide the accounting side of the work. They would provide training. So they would offer regular courses in basic things like first aid, lifting, all of those kind of generic things. So people's individualized employees would have a space to get that training and kind of support. So those are really useful kind of mid-level organizations, I think. And I guess here they would be, what do you call it, tier 2 organizations. But I think certainly in the early days of the direct payments for folks with physical disabilities in the UK, those were critical in terms of making people really effectively use the model. Okay, so some of the issues and challenges that we've seen in other places, and certainly we've seen in BC, I think probably made the point several times now, but if you just do individualized funding in isolation of the supported decision-making, the facilitation, the local area coordination, it's going to work well for a very small slice of your population. Primarily, again, folks with physical disabilities and maybe seniors who are quite able to say, I want this, I want to hire you, this is your job. It's not going to work particularly well for folks with intellectual and particularly more severe cognitive disabilities. Obviously, one of the problems that can occur, and certainly has occurred in Canada, is just reorienting a system. How do you break that inertia of, well, we've always done it this way? Right? Obviously, part of the point of these kind of seminars is to begin to sort of shift that culture, that training side. There's often quite a bit of resistance, and I think, given that it doesn't sound like you guys are going to have a lot of choice, the choice and control doesn't extend to you, obviously. But in Canada, a lot of agencies could choose to come in or not, and many of them resisted individualized funding. They didn't want to give up that power and control they had over their services. So that was a big issue for us. So really, events like this, it's really critical that there's training sessions, information, just to bring everybody along. So the whole, from the families, individuals with disabilities, providers, and government folks. And one of the challenges we had in BC, we set up a new organization called Community Living British Columbia, transferred all the developmental disability services to that Crown Corp, which had a completely different model, basically the kind of one I described. Well, we had to transfer all the government staff directly to that agency. And one of our biggest challenges was to get them to think differently. And some of them never quite got there, and some embraced it. But I wouldn't underestimate the educational sort of mental culture shift that's required to make this actually work. And I think for a lot of your organizations, in terms of your staff, there's some really important education training aspects that you're going to have to think about for them. A problem that comes up fairly regularly is when you're trying to make this kind of change in a heavily unionized environment. And I don't really know your situation here, but in Canada we have a lot of fairly heavily unionized environments. And I think in the UK it's a bit of a problem in places. So if you have a system that's highly individual, highly personalized, one of the things people really liked when we did an evaluation of the early direct payments programs was what users told us, and again, these were primarily folks with physical disabilities, is, you know, what I love is I no longer have to get up when the agency says they can send the staff. That when someone calls and says, do you want to go have a pint? I can say yes, because I can reschedule, reorganize my staff. That kind of model doesn't fit very well in a model where a heavily unionized, all right, I work these hours, the person with seniority gets the job, if somebody below it applies for it, you can knock them out. Obviously that's not going to work when you want the person to be choosing their staff, to be setting their hours, to be controlling it. You can get there, but I wouldn't underestimate the need to kind of start talking with your unions and trying to break, and really, maybe you're better here, but in Canada basically they transferred the auto plant model to social services. And it just doesn't work. And it particularly doesn't work in this model. So it might be an area you need to give some thought and start to, and this isn't an anti-union thing. It's quite possible for unionized staff to do this very effectively and to be protected. And staff protection is another issue in these direct funded systems sometimes. But they have to think differently. And they have to understand what their core purpose is. A lot of areas struggled initially with staff shortages. And I know I keep hearing this figure of we'll need 13,000 more jobs. How are we going to stimulate a market for social care? I think it can be an issue, but I think the reason some of your planners here and things are getting a bit worked out is I think they a bit misunderstand what a lot of people are going to want. In the UK and certainly in Canada, most people aren't going out and hiring professional staff. They're going out and hire John, who they know down the road, who they trust and they like, training him up for what they want and bringing him in. So I think getting stuck in a notion that we need staff with X qualification or X years of stuff is really going to hinder the actual progress. And I think you're going to find for a lot of families and individuals, it's not what they want. The primary thing for them is going to be, is this somebody I trust and would like to have around, and who I'm willing to, in many cases, share very intimate personal needs with? They're not going to be wanting the healthcare R Us to send up their staff. So I think as long as they allow for the flexibility, that staff shortages shouldn't be a big problem. And I'm going to come back to that when we talk about the rural remote. The research is pretty clear now that where you develop a system that doesn't have a strong facilitation planning side or a financial management side, that many families will find it way too difficult to take on. So we have a program for autism in BC where families get an automatic $22,000 a year for kids under 6 if they have an autism diagnosis. And they can use that money for therapeutic interventions, but fairly broadly writ. But there's no support whatsoever. So it's up to the family to find somebody to do the behavior plan, to find the behavioral interventionist, to hire those people, to do the payroll, superannuation, get the insurance, all that stuff. So you're asking a family that's already struggling with a child with very high needs to then take all this other stuff on. So a lot of families actually just send the money back, say, well, thanks, but no thanks. I just don't have the time to do that. So these systems are really critical to make it work, and particularly with our population, with folks with intellectual and more profound disabilities. Underfunding can always be a problem, and I understand there's some concerns about the levels of funding that they're tossing around for you guys. The best structure in the world can't compensate for underfunding. And that was the issue we ran into very quickly in BC. So we set up what we thought was a great structure, had all the bits and pieces and all the bells and whistles, and then the government cut the budget. And the way that people had to deal with the budget basically destroyed the whole integrity of the system. So the facilitator and planners, who were supposed to have 30 to 60 people to work with, so this beginning with 30 and building up as people got settled to 60, now have caseloads of 135. There's no way you can do real personalized planning and support for 135 people. So the structure was right, but the lowballing of the funding really destroyed the whole integrity of the system. We had some problem with agencies simply seeing IF as a way to fund what they've always done. So they simply, the accounting procedures change a little bit, but we're still doing the same thing we've always done. And again, that could work for some people, but does sort of raise the question of, well, why bother? If all we're going to do is what we've always done, then why go through all this pain and suffering for a new system? We've also seen problems in places where they really restricted flexibility. So where it works best is where you have maximum flexibility and potential for innovation. So allowing families to set up their own mini governance, and allowing things like microboards, really using the power of individualized funding in this structure to, the Chinese would say, let 100 flowers bloom, right? So not setting up, I don't know if they still do this, and probably some of this may not be the most politic thing to say. I was here in 2005-06 when I think Victoria was just kind of starting in the individualized funding stuff, and it sounded great. We were chatting away, and then they said, yeah, okay, but people will have to hire from approved providers. And I said, well, why are you doing that? Well, health and safety, this, that, the other thing. And I said, well, you realize you're going to stifle the bulk of the innovation and the benefits of this if you put those kind of requirements on. So that the less of those kind of bureaucratic restrictions you have allows, most importantly, the individual to really, truly have choice and control. But it's also, I think, a real boon for you guys. It lets you do all sorts of creative things and foster innovation and really find out how best we can make this work. So I would really resist a whole lot of things. And the other thing I noticed, this is definitely going to be impolite, Australians are really bureaucratic. That shocked me when I came here, because we think of Aussies as, oh yeah, g'day mate, yeah, come on over. We're thinking you guys are laid back, easy going. And then first I tried to get through immigration to come for a year. That was my first lesson in Aussie bureaucracy. Then I tried to get a driver's license. So you guys really have a tendency to over-bureaucratize and over-audit and oversight. The other play, when I started meeting with some of the state disability thing, they started going on about, what do they call it here, the audit and something systems, audit and over, and they were struggling with budget, and I'm looking at the stuff and all the money and the time they're putting, and I used to say, well, really, if you just got rid of all that crap, you'd have lots of money to actually do something, right? So I think you really need to be careful of how much because the safeguard in this system is the control of the person. But if they actually have the power and are making the choices and can control it, that's your safeguard. Because if they're not happy or feel threatened, they can take their money and go somewhere else. So you don't need all of this layering and layering and layering of safeguards. All in, all out approaches, that doesn't sound like it's going to be a problem for you guys. What I mean by that is in BC, another change they made to our system was said, well, okay, but you can't use individualized funding to purchase from existing service providers. So you couldn't have a mix and match. I think the UK allows that now, stuff, and it created a lot of problems because a lot of people are quite happy with parts of their current provider. They'd like a bit more control, so if they can control the money, it gives them a little more negotiating power. But they didn't really want to leave their employment support program. They didn't want to really leave this. But our system doesn't allow you, you're kind of all in or all out. So I understand that's not going to be the case for you guys, and that's a good thing. I talked about the onerous reporting, auditing, and oversight stuff, trying to avoid that. This will be a very popular one, I think, in a room full of service providers. I mentioned the problem with the unbundling and the transitioning. What we had initially proposed is to have a kind of 6 months transitional funding that would be available for agencies. So it would allow them to continue to fund the home if one or two people pulled out, and give them a grace period, if you like, to either find someone else who wanted to live in that house or transition other people out. Not very popular with governments. I doubt it'll be very popular with yours, but it's one of the few ways you can actually ease that transition and encourage people to take that risk of breaking up their supports. Where are we? Individualized budget models, all service funding types. Okay, so this is the unbundling bit I thought I was at before. And I think you probably already have this, but regardless of whether you go all IF or all not IF, I think it's really useful, and you may do this already, is if everything you do is budgeted to an individual. So even if it's a collective service or home, you can say, right, to fund this, we have 5 people in it, John pays this much. So to break it down, I think you may already do that, but I think you're going to have to do that with the new systems. So, and a little concerned about this one. I think it's with the individualized funding system, it's great, but what we always recommended is that agencies also had a small overhead administrative stipend that wasn't directly tied, which allows you to do the planning and the development and that kind of stuff. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can either have it as a grant, or IF has a small 5% administrative fee that comes off into a collective budget for the agency, and partly to handle, you're still going to need a receptionist, you're still going to need all of those kind of things that aren't going to be in someone's plan. So I don't know where they're at with that in Australia, but that's something, if I was you guys, I'd be looking at trying to make sure there's a way, it doesn't have to be a lot, but just to cover the things that allow you to continue to exist and grow and plan. Things like phase planning for service units. So if you want to move away from a group home, or the folks in it want to do it, set out a plan and a timetable. So you may not blow up all your group homes tomorrow, but maybe you have a plan over 2 or 3 years for folks who do want to transition. So trying to phase it so it's not a nuclear blast, but a little smoother process. Okay, rural and remote. We have the same problem, obviously, in Canada. That much of British Columbia, I'm from Vancouver. I don't know if anybody's been to Vancouver. It's a beautiful city and it's ringed by mountains. You go over the back of the mountain, you can walk for 1,000 miles until you hit a road. And then you'll find little towns and this stuff. So we have similar sort of problems as you guys. I personally think that individualized funding lends itself really, really well to these situations, because you're not dependent on a big provider or a big agency. So if you have a facilitator, someone who can more an itinerant. So for us, we will have a person who has a huge territory often, but it only has half a dozen little settlements, and they'll just move around and they get to know the folks who need it, do the planning, and help them hire, a lot of cases in Indigenous communities and things, it's Auntie Jane they want to hire. So your job is just to kind of help facilitate them hiring Auntie Jane, getting any supports or training that she might need to do that. So I really would discourage people kind of trying to replicate mini agencies in rural environments, and really embrace a more itinerant, flexible sort of model, really making use of IT now. It's so much easier now, because you can have training anywhere where there's a signal, right? Set up the computer, set up the thing. It's much easier now than it used to be to provide that. But for me, the key is to really focus on the highly personalized, not worrying about the fact, well, we don't have any trained staff up here. Well, say, go find Aunt Mary and train her. So don't try to replicate what we do in urban environments in this thing. Embrace the diaspora up there. So, you do need to provide some system of training and support. Like, one of the complaints we often got in BC is, well, all the training happens in Vancouver. I live 2,000 miles north of Vancouver. I need to take 3 planes, and it costs me a fortune. But I think thinking about how we can do that via video link, online stuff, there's a whole lot more options now we used to. So I would really embrace the IT revolution to provide those supports and that kind of thing. And it also just makes people feel a lot more connected to something. If you're the only support provider in your little community providing supports for the only person with a disability in that community, you can feel kind of cut off from the network. So really, computers are cheap now. Buy them a computer, pay for their connection, and the benefits you're going to get are going to be huge. Specialized, I'm sure you have the same problem here. One of the issues we have is if you need, say, specialized OT services or psychiatric services or those kind of things, You can get a little ways along that line with some of the IT stuff, some of the itinerant things, but I don't have a magic bullet that I'm sure you haven't already thought about already. It is a problem. What we try to do is minimize people having to leave their communities to get those supports, and if they do, making sure it's short-term and temporary. And again, IF systems help do that because you can bring your staff with you. You're not having to leave a service and find another service at another place. You can carry that with you, get the kind of specialist supports, and go back home. So, just, I guess my overall message is don't build a mini agency. Use the strengths of that community. Use the closeness and localness of it to actually make IF work. So just to wrap up, some things in general that we've found are useful in different sort of jurisdictions. Firstly, it's really important to have this integrated structure. I mean, again, one of the worries I have just from what I've been learning about the NDIS, you have the Tier 3, Tier 2, Tier 1. From what I understand, nobody's actually talking a lot about Tier 2 supports, and yet some of those supports are going to be critical for making it work. And I don't know about here, but I know in Queensland, the Deputy General or Director for Queensland Disability Service, he was quite proudly saying, and by 2019, we'll be out of the disability services business. And I'm kind of saying, well, hang on. Aren't you supposed to do these bits in here? So I think that might be an issue for you guys. It's important to make sure that IF is just one tool, one little piece, and it's a policy tool. It's all it is. It's not a panacea. It's not going to save the whales, but it can help. Not necessarily the whales, but maybe. So really don't get caught in the trap of thinking that that IF is what's going to provide people with good lives and what's going to actually help them realize their plans. That the facilitators, the planning, should always look firstly to the community, to the natural connections, to the natural supports. And where you need a little help to do that, or you need extra things, that's where IF comes in. But it's the plaster for the cracks. It's not the building. I always, somewhat over the top, but I tend to say, wherever you have to fund a service, that's a failure of community. So you need to always be working on building your community and your resources and those networks. And yes, realistically, we're always going to need some support systems. But that's the last place you look, not the first. So when we get into these things, sometimes the cart can drive the horse. So I do a little exercise with my students when I teach person-centered planning, where I give them a really complicated case, and I tell them, okay, go out and figure out how you're going to support this person, and you have no money. And it just really forces them to go, and they have to actually go out in our communities and come back to me with a list of, well, I talked to this leisure center, I did this, that stuff. Obviously, it's not fully realistic, but it's important to keep that mindset, right? IF is the last thing you think about, not the first. I think I talked about really using this to foster support and innovation, not just as another way to fund what we've always done. Really encouraging small sort of family governed, and that could be within your agency. You might have several units, or you might be supporting a few families to work in a group, or it could be something you actually just act as the catalyst or stimulus and help them launch into their own little thing. But really embracing the micro is going to maximize your benefits here. I like to talk about, what you want is a good enough system of oversight and reporting. You don't want a perfect system, because in my experience, the perfect system for an auditor is the worst system for human beings. And it is just going to stifle the innovation. It's going to stifle your ability to go out and do interesting things. Yes, we need oversight. We need to monitor. People we have a right to know what the government funding is going to, but keep it as simple as possible. You know, a good enough system is good enough, because a perfect system for an auditor isn't going to work. You know, I think really we talked a lot again in this Melbourne, that we've talked forever. I'm sure everybody in this room has been to at least 37 training days on personal network development, right? We talked about this forever. We don't do it very well. So I think we still need to be thinking about that how do we build those connections? How do we build those supporters, which are now even more critical, because now they're that supported decision maker. They're the core of the system in terms of giving people voice. So we still need to pay a lot of attention to that, and move it out of thinking it's kind of one of those cute and cuddly things people do on the side, to understanding it is critical to making the system work. The kind of agency I talked about in the UK, and I think encouraging these user-led support systems to do information, training, all of that sort of stuff. And any family will tell you the people they learn the most from are always other families. So if we can facilitate that and support that, for them to have that role in our system is really critical. I think this is going to be in your system, but that simple management piece, like trying to take the burden of the employment, registration, insurance, payroll off of the family's shoulders is critical. Flexibility and responsiveness. And last bit I'll talk about, and I think this is probably a role that you guys may need to play, even when people are hiring their own staff, one of the issues that does come up is they lose the backup they had with an agency. So if they just are hiring people, somebody has a car accident on the way to work, if that happens in your agency, you have somebody who backs them up. If you're totally self-managing, you don't have the backup. So we've seen systems in some of the UK models where an agency will have a contract with a provider agency for emergency support. So if the person's really stuck, there is a number they can call and somebody can be there within 20 minutes, half an hour. It sounds like a small thing, but it could be critical if you need this person to help getting out of bed. You don't have the luxury of somebody not showing up. So it's a little thing, but I think it's probably a role some of your agencies might want to think about. This is the advertisement. We're doing a big conference on all of this stuff in Vancouver next year, so anybody fancy a trip to Vancouver in October, you're more than welcome. I'll leave Daniel the info on that. And that's it. So thanks very much.